Uh, Good day, everyone. I'm truly excited because we have an important topic and sometimes a controversial topic, and we have a great speaker. So I'm truly excited. We have Professor Hugo Slim with us, and we will introduce Professor Hugo Slim in a minute. And we have participants joining us, more than 250 of them from all over the world. I know places it's a bit late in places like Australia, or it's the beginning of the day in Canada, but thank you all for joining us. My name is Unni Krishnan, and I'm going to be your host today, but I'm also supported by some fantastic volunteers from Warchild who has been working behind the scenes to organize this event. That is Maha, Nina, Robin, Sakina, and Winnie. And they will be actually monitoring the chat box. And in the event my connection fails, we have plan B and C. One of them will take over this webinar. And then they will also bring some of the questions which you are going to post in the chat box, and some of you have already sent questions in advance. So, but otherwise, thank you for joining us. The idea of humanitarian principles is important today. It has always been important. We will also hear from Professor Hugo Slim how critical the principles have always been in the past and why it is important for future as well. And I'm not going to say anything about it because you're going to listen to him in detail. Before we begin, I would like all of you to take a moment to remember the 3 aid workers who were killed in Tigray region recently, and also take a moment to remember the health workers and the humanitarian workers who have been fighting on the front lines in the response to the COVID-19 pandemic. Health workers, humanitarian workers, and all range of people who have been involved in that. If you can't hear me clearly, please put your name or put a hello in the chat box and mention the country from where you're coming or where you're based now, or a location where you're based. And if you are happy to do it, also please tell us your name and the organization or the union or something which you are associated with. No compulsion about your name, but feel free to say hello or good morning or good day so that we know that we are hearing you clearly. Thank you. So what we are going to do is that from this moment onwards, you can start putting questions, and we would encourage you to put questions rather than start a debate on the chat box. Then it becomes difficult to monitor the questions, and we will have time to take up those questions after Professor Slim speaks. Unfortunately, we couldn't get our webinar options running, so we are trusting each one of you to remain on mute unless we ask you to speak. So thank you for doing that. Thank you in advance. At this stage, I would like to invite Ramin Jamzani, the CEO of Warchild, to invite Professor Hugo Slim, welcome him, and introduce him. Over to you, Ramin.
Thank you, Uni. Good afternoon, everybody. I am equally as excited as Uni about this session. And once again, a warm welcome to all of you. I have the honor of welcoming our distinguished speaker for today's masterclass, Professor Hugo Slim. Professor Slim, I am truly grateful to you for making time for this session with us. Professor Slim has been a moral compass in the discourse on humanitarian values and principles. It is rare to find someone with a career that has a great balance between original thinking, research, academic work, practice, and policy work, all bundled in one person in the humanitarian sector. Professor Slim is a global thought leader in the ethics of war and humanitarian aid. He has written extensively about humanitarian values and principles for various audiences, both in the academic domain and in the media. He is the author of various papers and books, some prominent ones being Humanitarian Ethics, A Guide to the Morality of Aid in War Disaster, and Killing Civilians Methods, Madness and Morality in War. Previously, he worked with the United Nations, Oxfam, Save the Children, Humanitarian Dialogue Center, and most recently as the head of policy for ICRC. He also served on the executive boards of Oxfam Great Britain and Catholic Agency for Overseas Development. He is currently Senior Research Fellow at the Institute of Ethics, Law, and Armed Conflict at the University of Oxford. Personally, as someone who has worked in the front lines of some countries in conflict, such as DRC, Afghanistan, and Colombia, I'm very enthusiastic about this topic and looking forward to hearing and learning from Professor Slim and to the discourse and conversation that is going on. In War Child, the conflict setting is not new to us, and this topic is relevant for all of my colleagues, including all the colleagues that are joining us from around the world from other organizations. Uni, thank you, and I give the moderation back to you.
Thank you, Ramin. Thank you very much once again. I won't take any time at all because I know that you all have been anxiously waiting to hear from Professor Hugo Slim. So over to you, Professor Slim.
Thank you very much. Thank you, Ramin, for such a warm introduction and very generous. And Uni, thank you for organizing this and for inviting me to speak. It's a real pleasure to talk to so many people from all around the world, part of War Child's network, and to be invited by War Child, which is an organization I've admired from a distance for some time. And so it's a pleasure to be here. Uni has called this a masterclass, but I really don't feel a master on this issue in a sense. I'm not a master of frontline work. As Ramin pointed out, I've dotted about between academia, frontline work a long time ago in the 80s and early 90s, and then policy work. So I'm really an observer of the field, an accidental ethicist, because nobody else was doing humanitarian ethics really, and an occasional policymaker. And that career that Ramin described is a very interesting one, but it's very bad for your pension. So I think you should think carefully before you dot around between lots of organizations and lots of professions. So not speaking as a master, particularly of your context of where each of you are, I hope we can think together over the next 45 minutes or so. So I will start thinking for about 20 minutes and give you some thoughts. I'm going to think about three things. First of all, humanitarian principles as they are today, their history, and what they mean and how they operate today. And then secondly, I'm going to look at other non-neutral humanitarianisms, because one of the points I'm going to make is there is diversity in saving lives, in being humanitarian, and I think that's important. So we'll look at other non-neutral humanitarianisms. And then thirdly, I'll think a little bit about what principles are fit and appropriate for our day today, for the 21st century, as we can see it coming at us in the future, in the next few years. So first of all, humanitarian principles today and in history. And I think when most people use the term humanitarian principles today, they have in mind what I call the core four. So those are humanity, impartiality, neutrality, and independence. And these were the top four of the 7 fundamental principles that the Red Cross and Red Crescent movement agreed for their movement in 1965 in Vienna. And really, since the 1990s, those 4 humanitarian principles have become known as the humanitarian principles. They've not only been taken up by the Red Cross and Red Crescent movement, they were from the 90s onwards taken up by international NGOs in their own code of conduct, in their own practices, and then importantly, really taken up completely by the United Nations and states. So in a way, we can talk about those 4 principles, well, particularly humanity, impartiality, neutrality, as the sort of humanitarian principles of the neoliberal age, the last 30 years. They've become the norm. So briefly, what are they? Humanity. Humanity, in a sense, is the most beautiful, fundamental, basic principle of humanitarian work. In short, it means a commitment to protect life and health and ensure respect for the human being. And that's important. So it talks about life and health. So it talks about biology, about the breathing and blood of us as human beings, our bodies. And that is valuable, it affirms. Every human person and body is valuable, and their lives must be precious and saved. But it also talks about respect for the human being. And therefore, it's about each of us, the way we are as individuals. And it's much more as well about biography. So in the principle of humanity, we find a value and an importance to human biological life, the life of the body, but also to respect for the human being, the way that person is, as a man, as a woman, as a child, as an old or young person, their particular life they lead, and trying to protect that, their livelihoods, their education, all those things that are important to war child, that are part of a person's biography beyond their simple body. So for me, humanity covers those two things. The second principle is impartiality. And this simply says that wherever we see it important to save human lives, we must, in a sense, do that for everybody. So we make a commitment in impartiality that every human life is equally valuable. We should not discriminate on the basis of religion, race, politics, class, ethnic group, whatever. Every human life is equally valuable, and humanitarians commit not to discriminating human categories and social political categories. And we will only discriminate on the basis of need alone. So we will reach out first and discriminate first and prioritize people who are in the most distress and need help the most. So that's the principle of impartiality. So those two are really our deep values as humanitarians, that we value human life and human being, and that we value all of it and respond only according to people's urgent need. The third and fourth principles are really political principles about how we seek to operate in a war. And they are primarily about war, but also about, disasters as well, which have allocation or distribution issues. And neutrality is the third principle. And it basically says to ensure the trust of those fighting around us, we commit not to take sides materially or ideologically. In other words, we're not going to give unfair advantage to one side or another by giving them more food or more health or more schools. We're not going to take a material side, and we are not going to take an ideological side. So we will not join the dispute that the conflict is about and take an intellectual or political position on it. So that is neutrality. And the fourth, independence, is really about this idea of autonomy, that humanitarian agencies say we want to be independent of government, of warring parties, of communities, and we want to be autonomous and make our own decisions operationally. Autonomy, of course, is a Greek word, like a lot of English, and it means self-law, a law for ourselves. So we set the law on how we work, what our needs assessments are, how we organize distributions, etc. So independence is the fourth one. Now, thinking about how these principles, the so-called humanitarian principles as they're known today, operate today, they usually and typically operate with state consent. So they are adopted by an organization so that then it can negotiate with states and with armed groups and with others to have their place in the conflict agreed, because they will only be humanitarian, always be impartial, always be neutral, and always be independent. So that's what the position, the third party position they want to take in a conflict. So it's a very state-centric set of principles in a way. And it also finds legal echoes and references in the Geneva Conventions and the laws of war. And if you like, we could call this the Swiss model of humanitarian aid. It is this very neutrally orientated model of third-party, state-agreed, politically recognized engagement. And if you like, that Swiss model that emerged formally in the 60s through the Red Cross, Red Crescent movement is epitomized in ICRC, and it's sort of gone global in the last 30 years as the orthodox, normal idea of principled humanitarian action. And I'm going to say that that's not the only way of being a humanitarian. But before I do that, I also want to say that I think it's always a pity that when people talk of humanitarian principles, they talk only of those four, which are in a way rather abstract ethical ideals and political operational principles like neutrality. In fact, if you look at the Code of Conduct, which is another ethical code of the NGOs, you will see that there are 6 other really important principles, respecting culture and custom and working in a participatory way with people, capacity building where you can, doing what you can so that it's sustainable and lasts for people with, in their lives as much as you can. The principles 5 to 10 of the Code of Conduct are really important ethical principles because they're about how you work with people. It's not just about how you guarantee your political status with powerful armed groups and governments. It's how you work on the ground with people day to day. And I think it's a pity that those principles are overshadowed by these four humanitarian principles. And any commitment to humanitarian ethics must think about how you work, not just why you are doing it and how you want to be regarded by others. So the second point I want to make is about other humanitarianisms, because if that's the sort of current model of an orthodoxy of humanitarian principles, is it the only one? Is it the only way to commit yourself ethically and morally, to save lives, to protect people, to ensure children go to school? And I'm going to say, no, it's not, because there's a long tradition of other forms of non-neutral, side-taking humanitarianism. And I think we have to think of humanitarianism not as one thing, but as many things. And so there are different species of life-saving, just like there are different species of birds flying around us today. And many forms of humanitarian action hold to humanity as a principle. They want to protect life and health and respect human beings. And they want to do that impartially to anyone they come across who's wounded, hurt, hungry. But they take sides in a political struggle, in a resistance movement, as in Myanmar today or in Tigray today recently. They take sides. And my view here is that that is still a humanitarian commitment. It's still a humanitarian action, an act. And we've had different species of humanitarians through the centuries. And I think it would be unfortunate if all those species were wiped away and only the Swiss species survived. So solidarity, resistance humanitarians who take sides, they're a bird of a different color and a different lifestyle to the Swiss model, but it still has feathers, it still flies, it still lays eggs, so it's still a bird, if you like. And so I think it's important that different species of humanitarians are still recognized as being humanitarian. And if I describe those a little, the alternative species, they're found mostly either in state organizations or non-state struggles against a political opponent of some kind. And they work as humanitarians in organizations that prioritize political solidarity. And if I think back to the 80s and the 70s, many NGOs today were in fact in South America and Central America operating much more as solidarity organizations supporting community groups, peasant associations struggling against dictatorship. So they were working across Central America and South America against military dictatorships and supporting indirectly those who are very politically positioned, struggling for freedom. The same for South Africa. NGOs who were supporting humanitarian work in South Africa and in the frontline states were working against the South African government in support of the African National Congress, in support of equality for Black South Africans. So they were very politically positioned, but they were still doctors, educators, agriculturalists, whatever. And we've seen it in Syria too, in opposition areas of Syria, where people take a political position, but still work in a humanitarian cause to save lives, protect children, whatever. And so very often that species of humanitarianism is described more in terms of a commitment to solidarity, not neutrality, to solidarity, to resistance, and to disobedience sometimes. So if we look at some of the NGOs working to save the lives of migrants in the Mediterranean Sea who are drowning, often they are deliberately being disobedient and disobeying the laws set by Italy and the EU and Libya, and they are saving lives and taking those lives into Italy or whatever. So there's a tradition of solidarity humanitarianism, resistance humanitarianism, and disobedient humanitarianism as well. And I think it's important to remember that and recognize them as ethically valid but different. And they don't work with consent of the state necessarily. They work usually on one side of a struggle. And they might also be in governments. So you may have governments working to fight against rebels, and you'll have humanitarian people in those government health departments, in their agricultural departments, in their educational departments, who take sides, but are still committing their work to saving lives, protecting children, etc. And we've seen that in the COVID response, in disasters, and we'll see it more and more in climate action. People who are politically positioned and have taken sides in a place, but are also working for climate action of some kind. So thirdly, I want to talk about what principles, work for us today and tomorrow. Are we moving into a changing world? We're moving back into a world perhaps of rising authoritarianism, more conflict between West, East, East, West, North, South, whatever. We're looking potentially at not just small wars in that process, but very big wars emerging potentially with global powers at war again. And we're looking at a constant running climate crisis. So what sort of humanitarian principles do we need for those situations? And my answer to that is simply that we need different forms of humanitarian principles and different organizations. We need diversity in our understanding of humanitarian organizations. The Swiss ICRC model, the Red Cross principled model of neutrality and independence, is not appropriate everywhere for everyone. And not every organization should be imitating that model, as they have been really over the last 20 or 30 years. We need greater diversity. Neutral humanitarian action of that kind is incredibly important and essential in war, but it's not the ethical commitment that everybody can take or needs to take. So non-neutral solidarity humanitarianism is also very valuable and important to many people. And we need to respect that even though some people are taking sides, they are still humanitarian in what they do. And context is very important here, because I look around the world and I think that, and I don't know, there's so many people from lovely places listening to this, and I don't know what your situation is, your context is, but it often seems to be that many international NGOs and national NGOs who feel they must call themselves principled humanitarians and be neutral and independent and embrace these principles are actually not working in full-on war situations. They're often working in quite stable, non-war areas of a conflicted country with long-term displaced or people suffering the consequences of war, or they're working in post-war areas where the war is over, but the consequences are great. And in these places, they're faced with long challenges which people have around their rights as citizens, around their ability for access to health and education and shelter and land rights. And there's no need, I think, in that context, in that kind of context, to self-limit yourself as an agency by saying you must be guided by humanitarian principles of neutrality and independence, humanity, impartiality. I think in those situations, it's ethically important and legitimate, in fact, to enjoin political engagement with those societies to try and build just societies which are guaranteeing education, guaranteeing health, improving economic conditions for people, and to be part of social movements which are often politically positioned and making strong political arguments about the allocation of resources, the kind of government in place. And so I would say that it also depends on context, whether you need to be principled in those 4 principles, or whether you can adopt a more solidarity political form of engagement. And in that process, I think very often, a lot of people who call themselves humanitarians feel that they need to look at international humanitarian law and Geneva Conventions as their guide. In fact, I think very often human rights law is more appropriate. Human rights law runs continuously in a war as well as throughout peaceful situations. And often those rights, the rights to education, the rights to association, the rights to political freedoms, to organized society, are much more relevant to the kind of struggles that War Child and other children's agencies will be engaged in areas which are not really war areas. So I think the last question that's important about principles is the one about decolonization, which is very important at the moment. And I would say that in many ways, one of the most important principles, and this is the principle of localization, that we need to take into our work, it's not the conventional principles of humanity, impartiality, independence, whatever. It's a very profound principle of human rights, which is self-determination. And it seems to me that the importance of communities struggling to deliver aid to each other, for national organizations arguing for their rights to more international aid, is really a struggle for self-determination. And every society needs to determine its own humanitarian system. It has to make a contract between its people and its governments about the very fact that every citizen's life is valuable and precious. And so in many ways, I think we can go on saying humanity is an important principle, impartiality is an important principle, neutrality and independence, I think, are optional principles for humanitarians. But I do think self-determination for local humanitarian organizations, for national humanitarian institutions, is an important principle, alongside other ones like solidarity and, when necessary, resistance is an important principle as well. So I'll leave it there and hope we can have a discussion, and hope that sets a scene in some way. Thank you.
Wow, that is truly refreshing, thought-provoking, as well as soul-searching points. And I can see that each word can resonate with everyone on the call in one way or the other. Thank you very much, Prof Slim. I think there's no question of summarizing or relaying the key messages again. I won't attempt to do that. We'll go to the questions straight away. But I also pick up a couple of things that will make me to think for the years to come. The whole idea of solidarity humanitarianism, resistance humanitarianism, and disobedience as a form of humanitarianism for today's world as well as for the future. And most importantly, the importance of taking sides with people and children and those who suffer in humanitarian settings as an important factor influencing our thinking and action. So thank you very much. We have a few questions, and I'm going straight to Maha to read out the first question. And feel free to continue to put your questions in the chat box. We have at least another 15 minutes, so we have time. Go ahead, Maha. First question for Professor Slim.
Thanks, Uni. Thank you, Professor Slim. The first question comes from Raman Kumar. The principle of humanity is so wide that it covers the lives of human beings even beyond humanitarian crises. When it comes to the crises triggered by developmental issues from environmental, climate-linked, political issues, etc., is this principle considered by the world leaders and the various global nation groups when they put efforts to resolve or support these issues which do not fit exactly within humanitarian boundaries?
Great. Shall I take them one at a time? Is that okay? Raman, thank you for your question. It's a really good point. The principle of humanity is extremely wide. I mean, it should apply to us in any situation. If we see an old person fall down in the street in front of a car, we have a humanitarian obligation to protect that life and health and help them somehow. It's the widest possible world because it, as you say, covers all our ethical obligations as human to human. I would agree with that. And I suppose what I'm saying is that it's almost a language thing, that in English, the word has always been very wide. A humanitarian initiative could cover all sorts of things. But somehow in the sort of French and Swiss tradition, it's become very narrow, and that humanitarian just means this neutral project in war or disaster. And I think we have to reclaim your much bigger vision of humanity. And I would agree with you there. I think, and I should have said this, we ought to go further too, because I'm, being reminded by many people now, and many humanitarians are coming to this recognition. And it's a contradictory position that humanitarian values needs to go beyond the human. In fact, we need to become as concerned about our environment, our world, our non-human world around us, our trees, our fields, our seas, our water. We need to give as much value to non-human life as human life almost now. So humanitarian ethics is at a turning point where it's going to say, are we only going to be about protecting the human, or are we going to be about protecting animal, plant life around us? And if we take that very broad extension, then are we only concerned with water and trees and plants because we depend on them for human life, or do we think they are good in themselves? So this is, I think, a very important turn. I'm sorry I forgot to talk to this in my talk, but this is something we have to think about as humanitarians. Is it enough to value human life, or should we also value non-human life as an essential and important companion to human life in our work? So should in War Child you have children's valuing plants around them? Should you be investing in environmental projects for children to do, or should you just be protecting children's lives? So thank you for raising the breadth of humanity.
Thank you, Professor Slim. Nina, we have a few more questions. Would you like to move forward with the next question, please?
Yes, thank you so much. So much food for thought. But I have here a question from, I think I'm not going to pronounce the name right, so apologies for that, but Prusti, and asking whether you see localization more as an ethical and principled approach rather than as a management approach. And maybe if you could clarify what the difference or overlap would also be in that. Thank you.
Yeah, that's another great question. The answer is it's both. There's an ethical argument to localization, and localization will only be good if it's well managed, in a sense. But for me, the last 5-10 years have treated localization somehow as a management operational effectiveness question, and it has not worked. Localization has been a huge failure as I read it, from Oxford, admittedly. And therefore, it seems to me that localization, in fact, is not just an ethical issue, it's a matter of political rights. And that, I've just written a small paper on this, actually, and that's why I said today that self-determination is an important principle in humanitarian ethics, because if you go and read the UN Declaration, well, the UN Charter, actually, and then the UN Covenants on Human Rights, you will find almost always at sort of Article 1, a people's right to self-determination. And people outside that community, that group of people, that state, must not interfere and subjugate that people or dominate them. They must support and enable their self-determination, so that every community, every nation should be allowed to determine its own rules, its institutions, the way it chooses to live together. And that, for me, is the important principle in localization. And that's why I think the political right to self-determination applies to humanitarian self-determination. A person, India, Yemen, wherever, should be able to come together, form mutual aid groups, negotiate with government, form humanitarian institutions, agree humanitarian norms for society. That is self-determining their humanitarian values. And so for me, localization is an ethical and political right and value. And it's not just about, getting the most out of the donor dollar by using cheaper organizations to help people, feed people, etc. That's my view.
Thank you, Professor Slim. We have a few more questions coming. So I would like to go to Sakina now. Sakina, the next question, please.
Thank you, Uni. This question comes from Ryan. Is there a tension between humanitarian principles and human rights, especially in fragile and conflict situation? Principle humanitarian action ignores basic principles of human rights.
It's a great question too, Ryan. Thank you for it. If we go back to Raman's discussion of humanity, the principle of humanity itself, in a sense, covers all human rights in a way, respecting the person, protecting life and health, etc. So there should not be a tension between humanitarian action and human rights. And it's very important that when agencies are, delivering and driving and paying for humanitarian programs, they respect people's human rights in the process. They respect people's rights to participate in their own society, in their own organizations. They respect the right of men and women to work in their organizations equally, have the same pay, etc. These kind of human rights must be part of a humanitarian operation. I think tension arises in two ways. I think in a war, the reality is that war suspends and denies certain human rights. So that's why we have international humanitarian law. It becomes lawful to kill people, which is not under human rights normally. It becomes lawful for all sorts of bad things to happen that would be a violation of human rights. But human rights law doesn't stop. And I think it's very important that we go on holding to human rights for two reasons. First of all, because they are the fundamental rights of all human beings, and many of them are agreed by states. Secondly, they are much simpler than international humanitarian law and the Geneva Conventions. And usually if you're in a village or part of a city and you talk to people about the Geneva Conventions, it's very complicated, it's very vague, it needs lawyers to interpret whether a bombing which killed 20 people was legal or not. And if you talk about human rights and say you have a right to food, you have a right to health, you have a right to education, that's pretty simple. People know, and then they know how to work together for those rights. I think the other reason there's a tension is because often if, there are many states around the world that do not like the liberal approach to human rights. So if you start using human rights language and talking about human rights in a largely authoritarian state, which is resisting liberalism, then you will start a new fight. And so it's often simpler just to talk about humanitarian needs for people who are hungry, people who are sick, and not to talk about those people's rights against the state. So there's a tactical question about how much you talk about human rights in an authoritarian state to get things done.
Thank you, Professor Slim. I know that we are already, we are more or less over time, but I want to check with you. Would you have 5 more minutes to take one more question? Because we see a lot of questions coming in. Is it okay if we go ahead with one more question, Professor Slim?
Of course, of course.
Thank you. Maha, over to you, or Nina, whoever has got the next question, please. I know there are a lot of questions, but go ahead with the next one.
Okay, thank you. This next question is about neutrality and equity from Lee McQueen, who's saying that neutrality and equity appear to be at odds, especially when you're looking at the concept of pre-existing vulnerabilities, which lead to differential and disproportionate impacts on some compared to others. And so the question is it time that we upgrade and spell out these principles in relation to the context of complex and inter-community and national inequalities? For example, well, I'll leave it there. Thanks.
Good, thank you very much, Maha. So Lee, that's quite a complex question, probably way above my brain, but I think you're trying to suggest that neutrality, if you take a very neutral position, then you don't enter into ideological disputes about unequal societies, and I think that's probably true. I think a lot of organizations who think they cannot talk about a conflict will not talk about how some people in a place are richer and poorer and how that wealth discrepancy is creating tension and conflict or whatever. So I think that neutrality can self-censor organizations from talking about root causes or whatever you like. I think that's true. In terms of equity, though, in a way, the principle of impartiality, if you're doing it properly, it should allow an organization to focus on need. And if you're really focusing on need, then you should be able to prioritize more unequal parts of a society and say, those are the people we need to help. And therefore engage with problems of inequity in a society by making a better balance of educational provision, a better balance of health access, a better balance of livelihood and food access and things. But there's no doubt, I think you're probably right, that if you decide you're going to be neutral, you will be less likely to talk about inequality in a society. If you're saying I'm politically engaged and I'm concerned with equality, and you're working in solidarity with poor people, then you will talk more about inequality.
Thank you, Professor Slim. And I can see a few more questions coming directly into the chat box, as well as we have also received several other questions. But I'm actually going to say a suggestion we have received, that is, people believe that we should be running a series with you, Professor Slim, rather than one masterclass today. So I'm going to stop the questions at this stage, but I must also add here that, especially the points you made on localization as an ethical and as well as a political right, and that self-determination as a key idea to inform humanitarian action in future is something personally I will try to read more and listen to you more and understand better, and most importantly, apply it, because the topic of localization is going to be one of the topics we know will continue to trend in the months and years to come. And I think all your points on diversity and that non-neutrality, non-neutral solidarity and so on, that reminds me two things. One, I heard long ago as a beginner in the humanitarian sector that the hottest places in hell are for those who remain neutral during moral crisis. And the second one is actually a question or a statement from Desmond Tutu, who said that if you are neutral in situations of injustice, you have chosen the side of the oppressor. That is, if an elephant has its foot on the tail of a mouse, and you say that you are neutral, the mouse will not appreciate your neutrality. I couldn't really understand clearly at that moment what it means, but I believe after today's masterclass, I have a far better understanding of some of these statements and observations from the past. So thank you very much for bringing clarity as well as inspiring us to continue to question the system and continue to involve in the discourse and contribute to that. So thank you very much.
Thank you, Ben.
Thank you. I must also add here, Professor Slim, you may remember that you invited me as an examiner to accompany you to evaluate some of your students in Oxford nearly 15 years ago. And there is something I've not shared with you, which I'm going to share with you as well as everyone on this call right now. That is, well, for me, accompanying you as an examiner to evaluate your students was more of a learning experience rather than anything else. So I enjoyed the sessions for 1.5 hours. Then I remember hanging out with the students in the cafe and you were not there. And I overheard a conversation. They were talking about you. So I went to one of the tables and started listening. So who is this guy? What are you talking about? And they didn't know that I was in the room at that time. So they said, oh, this is a person you should listen to, etc., etc. Then I saw a poster of George Clooney on the wall and said, look, okay, tell me something simple and straightforward. If you had an option to go for dinner with George Clooney and Prof Slim, whom do you choose? They said, any day we would go with Prof Slim. So this is what I heard in that cafe today. So after listening to you, well, you began with a simple statement that this may not be a master class, but I would leave it with the panel, all the participants to decide whether this was a master class or not. My conclusion is this is more than a master class. So thank you for doing it. And once again, thank you for doing it, Prof Slim. I also want to thank our fantastic volunteers who have worked behind the scenes in the last few weeks and even bringing up this idea to invite Prof Slim. That is Anna, Maha, Nina, Sakina, Robin, and Winnie, and also Ramin for your support and your encouragement and also for joining us today. And most importantly, I would like to thank each one of you. I know it's time for some of you to sleep or begin the next day already, and some of you joining very early. So thank you very much for joining and also engaging very actively and contributing to the discourse. And I hope this masterclass is definitely helpful in one way or the other for you to take these conversations forward in your organizations as well as within your teams. So I'm going to close this session formally here, but this chat line and this call will be open for another 15-20 minutes for people to say hello to their friends and continue to post questions, which maybe one day we will bring up in the next episode of this masterclass. Once again, thank you very much, Professor Hugo Slim, for joining us today and making time for us today. Thank you very much.